Dark Journey, a tale of tragedy in 19th century New Zealand. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our channel. Today we'll be examining a case from the late 19th century, so sit back as we journey to New Zealand and explore a story of hope, desperation, and tragedy. A new beginning. Rosina Smith was born in England in 1862, a time of rapid transformation. Industrialization had turned cities into bustling centers of factories and commerce. But for many, especially young women, opportunities remained limited. Social expectations were rigid, with marriage and family often seen as their only future. For those without wealth or strong family connections, life could be particularly difficult. In the 1870s and 1880s, the British government actively encouraged young single women to immigrate to the colony of New Zealand. This young, developing nation desperately needed domestic workers, factory hands, and farm help. Men vastly outnumbered women, and the government saw immigration as a way to both balance the population and provide labour for the growing economy. For many women, this represented a chance for a fresh start, an opportunity to escape poverty and build a life of independence. In 1882, at just 20 years old, Rosina boarded the ship Rangatiki bound for New Zealand. The journey was long and arduous, taking around 3 months. The vessel carried hundreds of immigrants, mostly young women, as well as families and labourers, all hoping to forge a new life. Conditions aboard were cramped, food was rationed, and sickness was common. Yet for many, including Rosina, the hope of a better future made these hardships worthwhile. A new land. Upon arriving in Auckland, Rosina quickly found employment as a cook at the Exchange Hotel. Working in such establishments was common for newly arrived young women, as hotels, boarding houses, and private homes all required domestic workers. With a booming timber industry, growing ports, and rising agricultural activity, jobs were plentiful, if not always easy. Rosina did not remain in Auckland for long. After about a month at the Exchange Hotel, she relocated to Thames, a town that had experienced rapid growth in the 1860s and 1870s, following the discovery of gold in the region. She stayed in Thames for a time, but eventually decided to return to Auckland, where she worked at various establishments, including Harbourview House and the Duke of Cambridge Hotel. A broken promise. It was at the Duke of Cambridge Hotel that she claimed to have met a Mr. William Wilson, who worked as a carpenter. Perhaps like many young women in her position, Rosina hoped to find stability through a relationship. She may have imagined a future with this young man, believing he could offer the companionship and security she sought. However, according to her later testimony, she discovered that William Wilson was already married. A painful revelation that shattered any hopes of a future with him. She claimed his betrayal had forced her to face the harsh reality of her situation. Leaving her with little choice but to move forward alone, she opened a dressmaking business in Newton. But by then, she was pregnant. This was an era when unwed mothers faced harsh judgment and limited options, and Rosina found herself with few choices. Returning to England was impossible, continuing with the dress shop would be difficult, and finding another job as an expectant mother would prove nearly impossible. New Zealand offered opportunities, but it was not kind to women who broke social norms. And the lodging house. Eventually, Rosina moved into a lodging house in Parnell, run by a storekeeper named Mr. Wake and his wife. When she arrived, she introduced herself as Rosina Wilson. In late July, she gave birth to a baby girl. Although her confinement had not been particularly difficult, and the birth was not overly complicated, she struggled in the days that followed, suffering from fatigue and the usual challenges of new motherhood. The infant, whom she named Emily, was a healthy child, aside from a mild rash that was nothing of concern. Though the baby hadn't received much in the way of maternal care, Rosina did attempt to nurse her child. She was a quiet, reserved young woman, and despite her best efforts, it was evident that motherhood did not come naturally to her. Though she had been living in the house for more than a month, the Wakes did not appear to know much about the young woman's background. She told them she had arrived in New Zealand aboard the Rangatiki, but kept her past largely to herself. Very few people in Parnell had ever spoken to her, and most didn't even know her name. A stormy night. After a week, Miss Smith appeared to be recovering from the birth. At least physically, she was able to move about, and with the nurse's departure on August 7th, it seemed she was adjusting to life as a new mother. However, there was a sense of unease in the air, and Mrs. Wake wondered if the young woman was truly coping with the demands of motherhood. On the night of Saturday, August 16th, a storm raged through Parnell. Despite the tempestuous weather, Miss Smith left the house carrying her infant in her arms. The fierce winds and torrential rain seemed to match the turmoil brewing in her mind. Hours later, she returned alone. When Mr. Wake questioned her about the baby's whereabouts, Rosina's answers were vague and evasive. She spoke in riddles, offering no real explanation as to where the child had gone. Her manner was strange, almost distant, and her clothing was damp and quite dirty with mud. She had obviously been outside far longer than necessary. Growing concerns. It wasn't until the following day that her behaviour became truly concerning. She seemed agitated, restless, and withdrawn. She couldn't eat, and her anxiety was apparent. Her odd behaviour made Mr. and Mrs. Wake uneasy. They worried about the baby and began to notice inconsistencies in Rosina's story. She hadn't actually mentioned where the baby was, or how her clothing had become so dirty the previous evening. On Monday, August 18th, the tension in the house continued. Mr. Wake, now deeply troubled, decided to search Miss Smith's room. Although it appeared undisturbed, something didn't feel right, and he decided to confront the young woman. At first, she told them she had given the baby to friends in Waikato, a story that seemed strange. But as Mr. Wake pressed her further, her composure finally crumbled. She broke down in tears and told a very different tale. She said the baby had been ill, and in her desperation, she had given her laudanum, an opium-based medicine commonly used at the time, though notoriously dangerous. Her voice trembling, Rosina admitted that after the baby had fallen unconscious, in a moment of madness, she had thrown the child over the cliffs at Parnell. When Mr. Wake asked where exactly she had done this, she replied that the darkness of the night had clouded her memory and she was unable to remember the precise location. The investigation begins. Following this confession, Mr. Wake informed the authorities. Constable Hobson came to the house to speak with the young woman. However, when questioned, she did not confirm this story or provide any clear or coherent answers. Instead, she rambled in a confused and distressed manner, her words spoken in disjointed fragments that only deepened the mystery. She spoke of how she had lost the child, but offered no clear details about what had happened. At times, she seemed on the verge of revealing more, only to retreat into vague and contradictory statements. Her erratic behaviour and inconsistent responses only heightened the constable's suspicions. News of the missing baby spread rapidly through the small, close-knit community of Parnell, and the mystery became the subject of conversations in the streets, local shops, and among neighbours. Concerned residents speculated about the infant's whereabouts, and a sense of unease settled over the area. A crucial witness. It wasn't long before a man named Mr. Herbert Gent contacted the constable about a strange encounter he'd had with a young woman on the Saturday evening. A woman he now believed to have been Miss Smith. Mr. Gent was a gardener employed at the Grand Estate, owned by a gentleman named Mr. Mason. He told Constable Hobson that he had been standing near the gate of the estate when a young woman approached him. She appeared anxious and cradled a small, crying infant in her arms. Mr. Gent added that this young lady stopped and, in a nervous voice, asked whether the gate led to the domain, as she wished to take that route to Newton. Mr. Gent said that although he found the question a little odd, he told her she could reach the domain by passing through the gardens, but recommended she go around by Khyber Pass instead. He added that it was only after hearing about the missing baby that he realised the significance of his conversation. The grim discovery. Following this new information, Constable Hobson informed Superintendent Thompson, who assigned Detective Toohey and Detective Walker to investigate further. The next morning, along with Constable Hobson, the two detectives searched the area. Miss Smith was brought back to the location in a horse-drawn cart, as they hoped that if she walked the same path, the young woman might react or provide some clues that would help them uncover the baby's whereabouts. On the journey to Mason's garden, Rosina remained silent. However, as they got closer, a sudden and dramatic change came over her. Her breathing quickened, and she gripped the sides of the cart as though she wanted to turn back. It was apparent she was agitated, and her face turned pale. Then she cried out, "Don't take me there!" "It's there." There was an unmistakable fear in her voice. The detectives, along with Constable Hobson, searched the garden area. They moved carefully, brushing away leaves and turning over loose soil. It wasn't long before they uncovered what they had feared. Just beneath the surface of the earth lay the body of an infant. The child had been wrapped in a knitted shawl, and although the baby's face was swollen from the pressure of the soil, the body was remarkably well preserved. The sight of the poor child, now still and lifeless, sent a wave of horror through the men. There was a strange silence as they looked at each other, broken only by the faint sobbing of Miss Smith, who had been watching from a short distance away. As the body was placed into a box, Rosina's knees buckled beneath her, and with a gasping cry, she collapsed to the ground in distress. The sadness of the moment was overwhelming, and while Constable Hobson stood over the tragic discovery, he knew the case had taken a grim and irreversible turn. The investigation continues. The body was transported back to Parnell, and Mrs. Wake was called to identify it. She confirmed that it was indeed the child of Miss Smith, who had given birth to the baby just a few weeks prior. The baby had been registered in the name of Emily Wilson, with the father listed as William Wilson, though no one actually knew who this man was, so efforts were made to find him. Dr. Cobbett conducted a post-mortem examination at the police station in the presence of detectives. The examination revealed that the child had been well nourished and decomposition was only mild, likely due to the soil slowing the process. The neck showed no signs of strangulation, and no external injuries were found that could immediately explain how the child had died. Internally, the organs were in a healthy condition, but early indications suggested that the cause of death was suffocation. The contents of the stomach were placed in a sealed jar and, under Superintendent Thompson's direction, sent to Dr. Pond for further examination. An inquest was scheduled at the Auckland Hotel, overseen by the coroner, Dr. Filson. Public reaction. The case had caused much shock and horror among the public and had quickly become a sensational scandal in Auckland, with people discussing every detail of the tragedy. On August 26th, Rosina Smith was formally charged with the murder of her baby and sent to prison to await trial. There was much speculation concerning the identity of the child's father. The man Rosina had mentioned in her earlier statements had not been found, leading people to wonder if such a man existed or if Miss Smith was protecting someone else. Some even questioned whether Mr. Wake, who had reported Rosina's actions to the authorities, might have been responsible for her pregnancy, adding further intrigue to the case. A section of the community was unhappy with Mr. Wake's actions. They criticised him for his decision to involve the authorities, suggesting he had acted too hastily in bringing the police into the matter. The unexpected backlash took Mr. Wake by surprise, as he claimed he had only acted out of a sense of duty and moral responsibility. However, despite the criticism, it was undeniable that his quick actions had led to the prompt arrest of the accused and, more importantly, the discovery of the child's body. While some voices of dissent grew louder, others in the community reflected on the importance of such cases not being overlooked. They asked what it would mean for Auckland, and indeed for New Zealand, if incidents like this were allowed to go unnoticed. Many newspapers wrote that instead of criticism, Mr. Wake should be recognised for his actions, stating that he had simply done what any person with a sense of humanity and responsibility would have done in such a dire situation. Instead of facing criticism, they argued he deserved commendation for his role in bringing the truth to light. The trial. When authorities asked Rosina about the man named William Wilson, she told them she had been deceived by him. He had promised to marry her, only for her to later discover he was already married. There were those who sympathised with her, suggesting she had been left to face an unpredictable future alone, with no support, having to accept the harsh realities of her situation. They claimed her distress and desperation may have played a significant role in the death of the baby. The trial began on Monday, October 6, 1884, at the Supreme Court in Auckland. As the date approached, public interest in the case intensified. The shocking nature of the events and the unanswered questions surrounding the child's death kept the community on edge, and many were eager to see how the legal system would handle such a heart-wrenching and mysterious case. Mr. Hudson Williamson represented the prosecution and Mr. G.N. Bassey the defence. Mr. Bassey argued that on the night of August 16th, Miss Smith suggested that the tragic death of the child was an accident, pointing out the absence of any clear malice. If, he reasoned, a weapon had been used, it would have suggested premeditation. But as there was no weapon, that only supported the suggestion of her mental instability, marked by a combination of depression and insanity. He said that following the baby's birth, she did not seem to be a natural mother, but as the days went by, she became very caring. Mr. Bassey referred to medical texts, some of which indicated that smothering a child often proved to be unintentional, and he was sure that the death of little Emily Wilson was a tragic accident. Mr. Williamson, for the prosecution, disagreed with this theory and informed the court that an insanity defence required that an individual not know the nature of their behaviour. He claimed that the prisoner's actions were impulsive rather than premeditated, but she absolutely knew what she was doing. Witnesses were called, many of whom had given evidence at the inquest, and doctors gave their medical opinion on the sanity of Miss Smith. When asked about what had happened on the evening of August 16, 1884, Miss Smith denied any intention to harm the child, though she insisted she had little memory of the events that transpired. The verdict. When the judge summed up the case, he reminded the jury that their decision needed to be based strictly on the evidence at hand. He presented them with three possibilities. The child's death could have been willful murder, it could have been due to Miss Smith being insane, or it could have been a tragic accident. He urged the jury to scrutinise all these possibilities before making their decision. After a period of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. They found the defendant, Miss Rosina Emily Smith, guilty, but of the lesser charge of manslaughter. The judge, recognising the emotional state of the defendant, sentenced her to 6 months of hard labour. In July of the following year, William Wake, who by then had been drinking heavily, attacked his wife with an axe. Believing she was dead, he surrendered himself to the police. The good lady survived, but Mr. Wake was later sentenced to 2 years of imprisonment for his crime. This only fueled further speculation that he was the married man who had fathered Rosina Smith's child. Aftermath. The fate of Rosina following her release from prison remains unknown, but her story reflects the harsh realities faced by many women who travelled to New Zealand in the 19th century, alone, without family, and in a society that offered few options. Women often faced desperate choices. Many arrived with hopes of a better life, but instead found themselves vulnerable in a society with rigid expectations and limited opportunities. Rosina's journey, once filled with promise, ended in tragedy. Her life mirrors the struggles faced by many women who, far from home and without support, fought to survive in what was sometimes a harsh and unforgiving environment. Thank you all for listening. Please leave any comments or feedback you may have in the section below, and I hope to see you all again in the next briefcase.